You heard my name. I'm Jack Cruz. I'm a neurosurgeon. One of my clients and friends, you guys may know, asked me to come here and kind of give you the lowdown about the last 3 or 4 days, what I've kind of been through, and that's the only slide in my talk. I've had an interesting last 7 or 8 months. I've been deplatformed in centralized medicine for the better part of 20 years. I'm the black sheep of centralized medicine. He's the black sheep of the Kennedy family, and Rick is the black sheep in the music business. Because if any of you know his history, he founded hip-hop while he was studying to be a lawyer at NYU and completely changed the music industry. The difference is the middle black sheep has become a cultural icon, so he cannot be cancelled. And he happens to be also a patient and a client of mine, so I did. A talk in El Salvador that was kind of interesting in August. And the person who decided to set me up to, how shall we say, meet Bobby Kennedy is someone that you guys probably know. Probably the most famous technology company in the world. Him and his wife got divorced and they have an autistic kid, and she wanted to hire me to reverse the kid's autism. She offered me $100 million to build a decentralized hospital, and I told her I'd only consider something like that if it was done on my terms. And you know, when you deal with somebody who has $9 billion, generally they don't like that. But I told her it couldn't happen in the United States. It's impossible. So long story short, she says, well, I would like to get you with Bobby Kennedy. Most of you guys know or probably have preconceived notions, you know, of what he is or what he's not, but she obviously wanted to get us together to talk about vaccines because she believes that the vaccine schedule in the United States had a big deal to do with her daughter's autism. And I told her in no uncertain terms that I'd love to meet with Bobby, but that wasn't really what I wanted to talk to Bobby about. The lady in question probably caused her child's autism. She's a patent attorney for Google. And the reason that all your computer screens are blue lit, the reason none of them are red lit, the reason none of them pay attention to circadian biology is because that original technology was developed in a government. Program that Bobby Kennedy knows about, and I happen to know about because I went to medical school at LSU. For those of you who've never heard about Operation Paperclip and MK Ultra, you think it's all conspiracy theory. So I'll ask you guys a question before we start. What's the difference between fact and fiction to you? Anybody want to scream it out? Fiction has to make sense. The truth doesn't. In fact, the truth, that's why people call it conspiracy theory, because it makes no sense until you see all the parts come together. Together, so at Tulane Neurology and Tulane Neurosurgery in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, the CIA started a program there where they would do all these crazy things to monkeys. And what the goal was back then, the CIA wanted to see how they could control things utilizing different things like drugs and things like that. Where the neurosurgeons got involved, which is my clade, we would drill the tops of the heads off, put wires into the thalamus, put electricity in there, and kind of see what kind of behavioral changes we could have. One of the guys that was in that program was a guy named Professor Delgado. He got the idea to take it to a bigger animal. When he saw that we could control the behavior with the wired device, he said, what if we do it wirelessly? So he checked it in monkeys and checked it in bulls, and it turned out you can do it wirelessly with RFID chips and semiconductors. Then the CIA took it to the next level. They said, well, since this is electromagnetic radiation and it can be done wirelessly, what if we did it through light, through screens? And it turns out you can. And that's the reason why all your computer screens have the frequencies they have. So why is this all important? Well, the person that set this meeting up between me and Bobby is the patent attorney that made sure that Google and Meta have those things so they can control the things that we all do. Where did the original idea come from? That started off in MK Ultra with the CIA. You're going to Be surprised when you hear this came from the mafia in Las Vegas. They wanted to build a new city in a desert. They enclosed it all, blacked out the windows, invented slot machines that were blue lit, and they found out that they didn't have to take a gun, stick it in your face to steal your money. Then they even got smart. They said, let's give people free alcohol while they're doing that, and they found out they got the money quicker. And that's when the CIA got the idea to start this program. That's really how it started. So for those of you in the room, you probably know a little bit about Bobby Kennedy. I just told you a little bit about technology, I told you a little bit about the CIA, and I told you a little bit about the mafia on November 22nd. In 1963, his uncle was killed in Dallas, Texas. On that day, that's the day that I would tell you, as an old guy, because I'm probably the oldest guy at this conference, that's when the heart of America was taken out. A couple years later, 5 years later, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's daddy were killed. And that's when the mind and the soul of the United States was removed. So one of the first questions I asked Bobby in this podcast, and just so you guys know, this podcast was done 2 days ago. It's not out. You're going to hear some things of why I wanted to talk to Bobby that is probably going to affect some of you. And I'll ask a question before I tell you this story. I'm sure none of you will tell me the truth, but how many took the mRNA vaccines? Anybody want to raise a hand? Okay, good. This story is going to be really interesting to you. So I did my residency at LSU, and in the 90s we used to take care of brain tumors and different things like that. And down in the basement we had a linear accelerator. Linear accelerator is something that is involved in nuclear physics. This hospital that I was in was a small little wispy hospital. So I finally asked a question, why in the hell do we have $1 million machine in this hospital that clearly can't afford it? And it turns out the story was that the CIA bought this linear accelerator because of the programs that I mentioned to you at Tulane. The name of this hospital is called Ochsner Medical Foundation. I did 2 years of my residency there. Dr. Ochsner, Alton Ochsner, is and was Dr. Fauci 1.0. Okay, the reason why most of you don't know about him is tied to the reason why his dad and his uncle got killed. Okay, so the CIA hired Dr. Ochsner, and Dr. Ochsner was the first head of the National Cancer Society. I want you to remember that's an important fact in the story I'm going to give to you. In the 1950s, the focus was on polio, and the reason it was on polio is because our president, FDR, got it. He was succumbing to it. He was going to die. He had a famous lawyer friend in New York who started the March of Dimes. You probably heard of that. It was actually collecting dimes, all that research to Jonas Salk and his vaccine. Have you ever wondered anybody... In the room why Jonas Salk never won a Nobel Prize, there's a reason it's called the Cutter event. And you may not know about the Cutter event. The reason why it's been scrubbed from the annals of medicine, it's also been scrubbed from medical textbooks, and it's also scrubbed from the FDA website. But see, I'm an old guy. I trained at a time before cancel culture, and I learned about this in medical school. Basically what they did, Jonas Salk was tied to a pharmaceutical company called Cutter Pharmaceuticals, and this is, remember, 1951. We didn't discover DNA until 1953 with Watson and Crick. They used African green monkeys to grow the polio virus on to make the vaccine. The vaccine was made and it was ready to be tested in 1950 and 1951. At the same time, a researcher named Dr. Bernice Eddy, who you probably also don't know because she was really the first doctor that was cancelled, she did some testing on the Cutter vaccine before it was given to humans, and she injected it into monkeys, and every single monkey got polio. She sent that information back to the people at the FDA, and they were like, there's no way we cannot stop this rollout. This caused a big stir. Dr. Ashner, who was running this program with the help of the federal government, he actually worked for the FBI and the CIA at this time, was so adamant that he took his grandchild, female and male, in the amphitheater of Tulane Medical School down on Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans, a place that I did my residency at. I've been in this amphitheater multiple times, and he injected both of his grandchildren. His grandchild, the male, died in 2 days, and the granddaughter got a mild version of polio. It was at that time that people realized there was a big problem. But the bigger problem came when Bernice Eddy started to look into this. She found out that there were multiple viruses that were grown in the polio vaccine that went out, and 120 million people in the world from 51 to about 55 and 56 got this. The one that you guys may have heard of because it's been in the news a lot, something called SV40. What does SV stand for? Simian virus 40. That tells you there were 39 others, but simian virus 40 is important, and African green monkeys have this virus in them. It is in them, doesn't bother them at all, they don't get any problems. But when you take SV40 out of any African green monkey and put it in any other animal, they always get soft tissue cancers, 100% guaranteed. So Dr. Ashner, as I told you, was the first National Cancer Society president. He began to realize very quickly from 51 through 55 that there was going to be a huge cancer outbreak in the next 40, 50 years. His best friend politically at that time was a California politician you may have heard of, named Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, when he became president in 1971, started the war on cancer. The reason why is because they knew what the cause of this problem was. So what happened? The original goal of Dr. Ashner was to try to figure out a way to solve this problem that he, in fact, caused by rolling out the polio vaccine. So the linear accelerator was brought by the CIA and placed in a place called a US public health hospital. And this is across the street from Children's Hospital in New Orleans on Henry Clay Boulevard. Why do I know all this? Because I did my residency there. Right across the street is this big 3-story building that just sticks out like a sore thumb. And the outside of this place is kind of like the outside walls that you've seen in this building that we're having this talk. And it looks like a military installation. At the same time, a lady named Sarah Stewart, who went to the University of Chicago, she was an expert in viruses causing cancer at a time nobody believed it. She was kind of like the black sheep of her day, like I'm the black sheep of mine today. And she was recruited by Dr. Ashner. At that time, she was reassigned from the NIH to the US Public Health Hospital, and at the same time, an orthopedic surgeon named Mary Stewart. They're not related, but they went to medical school together. She was an expert in nuclear physics. She also was an expert in bone cancer. To this very day, her stuff is still cited. They both were brought to Ashner Medical Foundation, and then covert research was begun. What was the goal? They tried to cure the cancer they caused, but instead they found something interesting. Every time they used electromagnetic radiation on SV40, remember this is before they knew anything about DNA, they found that the cancers got worse and worse and worse. In fact, instead of getting it better, they made it worse. And the reason now in modern molecular biology we know X radiation, or high-energy particles, breaks DNA up into little pieces. Okay, so they created a bunch of little pieces. So 1959 comes along. Bernice Eddy is at a New York Academy of Science meeting and drops the bomb in front of an audience just like this. People that knew about what was going on with the polio vaccine, but they didn't know that the polio vaccine had SV40 in it. She decided to out it to the public because she felt what was going on behind the scenes was kind of dirty. And you'll find in centralized medicine this happens quite often, not just about vaccines, about a lot of other things like cholesterol and heart disease and neurodegeneration. But that's not what this talk is about. So the next step that happens in 1959, Fidel Castro has a revolution in Cuba. He takes the island over. All of the guys that were most pissed off were guys in the mob. They lost all their casinos. Other people that were pissed off, guys like Dr. Ashner, who don't like communists. The reason why is Dr. Ashner's hospital, even when I was a resident there, used to have all the flags of Central American and South American countries because he took care of all the dictators around the world. He was also very ultra-right conservative. It's the reason why he was friends with Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and he was not really a big fan of Kennedy. So the idea came upon, what do we do with this problem? So just like any good politician, always use a tragedy for your benefit. They decided to make a bioweapon out of the polio vaccine, and they used the Linux to do it. Now, what we know today, and we didn't know then, is that electromagnetic radiation creates an increased rate of the way this DNA is taken up into a virus. That's the way that they knew that they were creating a stronger and stronger virus. So what did the CIA want to do? They wanted to put it in tobacco and deliver it to Fidel Castro to kill him. If they couldn't do that, they wanted to inject him with something, so they had to have a plan to get somebody into the country to inject him. And that's where Lee Harvey Oswald came into the story. And many of you may not know the story because you're so young. But Lee Harvey Oswald was given the opportunity in the 50s to defect to Russia and come back to the United States very easily. It's kind of the craziest story ever, but it was a front story so that Fidel Castro would not think that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA agent, so that way he could be the person to deliver the payload when the time came, when it was ready. So now we're in the 1960s, 1962. We have the Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs is when his uncle did not give any Air Force protection in the Bay of Pigs. And one of the airline pilots, who was a disgraced Eastern Airlines pilot named David Ferry, got shot down. He became really anti-Kennedy. At the same time, Dr. Ashner actually hired him too. So he worked on the team with these two other famous cancer researchers, just a disgraced pilot because they needed bodies to run an off-site program to continue to strengthen this bioweapon. Then they found a young girl, 18 years old, who won In 1949, a science award in Braden, Florida names Judith Vary Baker. She started to work on viruses that cause cancer back in the 1960s, which is very, very unusual. And Dr. Asher recruited her, promising her that if she worked in his lab, she would get advanced standing in Tulane Medical School and become a doctor very quickly. So that's the group of characters we have in 1963. In the summer of 1963, the experiments continued and they made a bioweapon. The day before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Lee Harvey Oswald, Clay Shaw and David Ferry went to Clinton, Louisiana, where Dr. Asher directed an Angola death row inmate to go to a mental hospital in Jackson. There, David Ferry injected this toxic soup to see if it would work. Okay, and this shows you the level of ethics that were going on at this time. Judith Vary Baker had to come back to the hospital 2 weeks later to confirm that he got cancer, which he did. He died 4 weeks later. The reason why this is a big story, if any of you watched Oliver Stone's JFK movie, you'll note that the only person that was ever prosecuted for John F. Kennedy's death was Clay Shaw. And the reason why he was prosecuted, why he was linked to this, the prosecuting attorney was Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison's daughter, Virginia Garrison, was my ER nurse during my intern year in residency. That's how I know a lot of this data. So what happens next is Garrison puts Clay Shaw on trial. The trial is unsuccessful, but the reason the trial was unsuccessful is Dr. Asher is like a rock star in New Orleans. Garrison knew that he had the goods on him, but he didn't go after them. That was probably a big mistake. He decides to go after David Ferry next. Who's the disgraced pilot I told you about? He's a very weird guy. But David Ferry winds up dead the next day. They find him in his apartment, and interestingly enough, they find a document kind of like this with all these scientific things. It's got different chapters and it's all about cancer-causing viruses from monkeys. Garrison had the smoking gun, but he had no proof at all. Judith Vary Baker was shuttled off to Florida after all this. And then, the craziest part of the story is Mary Stewart, the famous In 1963, a cancer researcher at a US public health hospital had an accident. She grabbed a stick to turn a machine off and ended up incinerating her entire right arm, her thorax and her face. Funny thing is, she wasn't found at the hospital. Instead, she was discovered in her bed on Magazine Street in New Orleans, lying on a smouldering mattress. This happened 6 months after JFK was killed. What's the reason for all this? They had to hide what they were doing in that private lab. That was the last link that could trace back to Dr. Fauci 1.0. After the botched prosecution of Clay Shaw, everything was lost to science. The interesting part was all the things they did, because Mary Stuart's house was scrubbed of all her medical belongings. They couldn't find anything. Somebody finally started to ask the question, where did all the monkey virus go? Turns out, my anesthesiologist when I was a resident, Dr. Ripple, his dad ran the JKS lab in New Orleans. This was the place where we used to do operations on monkeys and perform peripheral nerve surgery. I actually worked in this lab in the 90s. But this stuff was going on in that lab for MK Ultra and other projects back in the 50s and 60s. Everybody knew about it. PETA, the people who oppose animal testing, broke into our lab when I was a resident and let the monkeys go. I was quoted in the paper saying something about it in New Orleans. Ever since that time, I've had a lot of trouble with activists. So much trouble that about 12 years ago, when 3,700 people were supposed to come hear me talk on a cruise ship, someone from PETA claimed I was bringing a biological weapon on board. The FBI came in, ransacked the cruise, ransacked me, and took me off the ship. They wouldn't let me back on, even though 3,700 people came to see me. Why? Because people knew I had information that I probably shouldn't know and didn't want anyone talking about it. So the chain of events with this monkey virus gets transferred in. In 1964, the monkey virus was transferred to the Delta Primate Center in Covington, Louisiana, where they conduct primate research under the direction of the Department of Defense. This place has been operating since then. Dr. Ripple's dad ran that place, and the reason I became aware of it is because the day I was mentioned in the Times-Picayune, I asked Dr. Ripple about this issue. I said, look, I know your dad used to work there. He would never talk about what his dad was involved with. But he did that day when I was preparing to perform a craniotomy in the middle of the night. Some of the things he told me made me start asking questions. I began putting things together and realized I needed to find out what happened with that monkey virus. So it turns out in 1971, the monkey virus research went to Fort Detrick. If any of you see the black sheep of the Kenny family up there, he just wrote the takedown book for Dr. Anthony Fauci. In that book, you'll see all the links to Fort Detrick from 1971 all the way up to the Patriarch when they knocked the Twin Towers. All of our biologic weapons stuff was done in the United States. Ironically, several viruses got out when Obama was president. Obama shut down the bioweapons program, and guess what he told Dr. Fauci to do? Go offshore. And guess where he went? Wuhan. So gain-of-function research continued. Now, is one of my members okay? He pays me to make sure that I'm protecting him and his family. On July 4th, 2020, I had 100 members at my house. I told them there'll be no American flag, and I'm going to tell you two things. We're going to talk about two things: decentralized medicine and decentralized money. I said, make sure you buy Bitcoin. At the time, it was about 78 grand. I said, but make sure when they come out with this vaccine that you never take it. And I warned them. Then, we're talking 3 years ago, that I think there's a pretty good chance that you're going to find out in a messenger RNA vaccine, we're going to find DNA plasmas that are not supposed to be there. And we're probably also going to find out that SV40 is contaminating the viruses. I want you to remember this timeline. I never talked about this publicly ever. Why? Because I'm a little bit smarter than probably I am right now. The virus comes out, you guys can have whatever ideology you feel about it. I think you probably know what mine is. But the real story breaks about 2 months ago. 2 months ago. And you should write this name down because you need to follow him on Twitter. His name is Kevin McKernan. He worked on the Human Genome Project for Craig Venter, so he's got serious chops in molecular biology. And he now works in the cannabis industry, and he decided to take Pfizer's vials and test them for those DNA plasmas and the SV40. And guess what he found? They're in there. So, of course, you can imagine when he posts this on Twitter, all the wackadoodles that you know are procs wanted to bury him. So, one of those wackadoodles, also a very accomplished molecular biologist at the University of South Carolina named Philip Buchholz, second name you want to write down and follow their Twitter account, he did the testing 4 weeks ago and confirmed that finding. So now most of you, while you've been hertzing and drinking and partying, you didn't know that the vaccine